I should begin with a confession. For a man who has spent his life telling stories, nothing is more unsettling than discovering he no longer knows where the story truly ends. I am old now, older than many of the kings and queens I once praised in my songs. Most mornings I wake to the creak of my joints and the creak of these floorboards, and I am not sure which sound is closer to breaking. The room where I sit is small. A table, a stool, shelves bowed under the weight of books and rolled parchments. One tall window. Through it I see only a strip of sky and the jagged line of rooftops. Yet every evening, when the light turns the air to dusted gold, the glass shines like the surface of a very still lake. On such evenings I catch my own reflection, and for a heartbeat I almost see her, the girl everyone insists on calling the Lady of the Lake. She would laugh at that. Ciri never liked grand titles. She wore them the way a soldier wears a borrowed cloak, useful in bad weather, irritating the rest of the time. Princess of Cintra, Child of Destiny, Witcher Girl, Source, Swallow, Lady of this, Lady of that. The world piled names on her shoulders the way a drunken audience piles empty mugs on a stage. Heavy, noisy, impossible to carry for long without dropping something. You are listening to me because of her, not because I once sang before courts and under gallows, not because I survived wars that swallowed kingdoms whole. You are here for the girl who walked between worlds and left behind only fragments, a broken sword, a handful of songs, a few chronicles scratched by men who never truly looked her in the eye. I did look her in the eye. That is why I must speak. The first time I heard the words Lady of the Lake used in earnest, the war was already over. I was lingering in a wine cellar in Toussaint, the sort of place where the casks outnumber the regrets, when a young troubadour began to sing a ballad about a silver-haired enchantress who rose from the waters to hand a shining sword to a spotless knight. The melody was clumsy, the rhyme forced, but the audience sighed in all the right places. They loved the image. Armor bright as noon, water dripping from the blade like liquid moonlight. Two beautiful strangers exchanging promises no one could quite hear. I hated it from the first refrain, not because it was badly written, though it certainly was. I hated it because I knew at once who the song was trying to be about, and I knew that the girl in his verses was not Cirilla of Cintra. She was smooth legend, polished until nothing dangerous remained. There was no hoarse laughter, no chapped lips, no stubborn, furious courage that did not look pretty at all when you saw it up close. That night I understood that if I did not begin to set down what I knew, the truth would vanish beneath layers of gilded invention, like a body beneath snowfall. You may think this the vanity of an aging poet afraid of being forgotten. There is some of that. Age makes us count not only the cups of wine left on the table, but also the stories we have not yet told. Still, it is not my name that troubles me when I stare into that glassy window. It is hers, and the names of those who walked at her side, if only for a while. Geralt of Rivia, with his white hair and yellow eyes. Yennefer of Vengerberg, with her raven curls and impossible will. In the newer songs he becomes a butcher or a saint, she a temptress or a villain. Both portraits sell. Neither is true. And then there is me, Julian Alfred Pancratz, Count de Lettenhove, known on tavern benches and royal balconies as Dandelion. History will likely remember me, if at all, as a frivolous accompaniment to more serious lives. A man with a lute always hovering at the edge of great events. For once, I do not mind. The edge is where one sees best. From the edge, I watched kingdoms burn and treaties signed. Friends die and enemies prosper. Songs fly from my hands like birds and return to me with different plumage, changed by other mouths. That is why I begin here. Not with Ciri herself, not yet, and not with Geralt or Yennefer or the roar of battle at Brenna. I begin in this small room with dust in the corners and ink on my fingers, because this is the only honest place to start. You must know who is talking to you and what his weaknesses are before you can decide how much of his tale to trust. My weakness is simple. I love them, all three. The Witcher, the sorceress, and the girl who was neither and somehow both. My love was rarely practical, never heroic, often foolish. It expressed itself in the only way I truly understood. I turned them into stories, ballads and laments, scandalous verses when money was short, quiet songs when my heart ached too much to shout. Sometimes I wonder if I did them a disservice, freezing their faces behind fixed expressions, trapping their lives in tidy stanzas. Yet, what else could I do? A man repairs shoes, another hammers iron, a third ploughs the earth. I had words, music, and a certain talent for surviving tavern brawls by diving under tables at the right moment. We use what we have until the day we no longer can. You and I, then, shall attempt something different together. For once, I will not try to make the story prettier than it was. I will try not to sand down the roughness that made them who they were. I will tell you how Cirilla really moved through the world, how her boots splashed through mud as often as they glided over marble, how her hands shook when nobody was watching. I will tell you of Geralt when the sword slipped from his fingers and he understood that even witches can be afraid. I will tell you of Yennefer when her magic failed her and she had nothing left but the hard, naked edge of her will. You will notice gaps. You will hear me say that I do not know, that I can only guess, that I am borrowing the eyes of others. I will lean on the accounts of scholars and sorceresses, on the dreams of those who still touch the fabric of time in ways I never could. I will admit when memory has blurred the edges. In return, I ask only that you listen not as a judge, but as a companion at the same table, sharing the same candlelight. Outside, the sky is already turning the colour of old parchment. Soon my servant will knock and remind me that it is time to eat, and I will wave him away. Because the hunger that grips me now has nothing to do with bread or stew. It is the hunger of an old man who knows that somewhere out there another foolish song about the Lady of the Lake is being born, and that if he does not speak, silence will choose the ending for him. So let us begin at the edge of the water, not the water in my window, but a far more ancient lake veiled in mist, where a weary girl once stood and stared at her own reflection and saw not a legend, not a title, only a face she barely recognized. Somewhere a knight in shining armor rode toward that shore, dreaming of a miracle. Somewhere a poet was already sharpening his quill, eager to turn their meeting into a neat little allegory about destiny. but we still wonder whether a story like hers ever truly belongs to destiny at all, or whether it belongs first and last to the frightened young woman who had to live it. By the time people began calling her the Lady of the Lake in earnest, Ciri had already disappeared from my life like a song cut short mid-verse. That is the way with legends. They tear out the last untidy pages of real stories and slide in something smooth, something that can be recited after the third jug of ale without catching in the throat. The more complicated the truth was, the more polished the lie becomes. The first rumour reached me in a fishing village. Nothing remarkable, just a huddle of houses that smelled of smoke and brine, the kind of place you forget as soon as the next crossroads appears. I had stopped only because my horse had gone lame at the most unpoetic puddle imaginable. While I argued with a farrier over the price of a new shoe, I heard the name Cirilla whispered near the well. Not shouted, not sung, but breathed out, as if the speakers were afraid the water itself might be listening. A young woman was holding court among the buckets and ropes. Her cousin's husband, she swore, had seen a pale figure walk out of the local lake at dawn. Barefoot, hair streaming, sword in hand. The fishermen, half awake, had frozen with their nets dripping in their fingers as the stranger held the blade out to a kneeling knight. The teller ladled on the wonder. The armour shone like a second sunrise. The birds hung in the air to listen. The girl was, depending on the sentence, a goddess, a spirit, or some nameless power of the deep. No one mentioned mud, or cold, or the weight of a wet sword in stiff fingers. When her cousin's husband supposedly asked who the apparition was, the knight answered, in a voice that echoed over the waves, that she was the Lady of the Lake. I nearly choked on my own breath. That was not Galahad's way of speaking. I would wager my best lute string on it. The tidy title had already been supplied by some diligent balladeer who had never stood on a real shore at dawn, never stood near a real girl who could cut you in half with a glance long before she reached for steel. It would have been easy to dismiss the tale there and then, blame too much brandy and too little work. But the rumour did not stay in that village. It travelled. Stories are like burrs in a horse's mane, or stains on a minstrel's doublet. They cling. I heard versions of it again and again as I wandered from town to town. Sometimes the knight was nameless, sometimes he was called Galahad, a stranger from distant lands whose blood carried all the courtly dreams people had half forgotten. Sometimes the blade he received glowed with enchantment. Sometimes it was described as dull and nicked, though the teller quickly corrected themselves, afraid the audience might lose interest. I recognized the pattern at once, because I had helped weave it so many times before. Take a handful of scattered facts, trim away the awkward edges, then lace them together with melody until listeners nod as if they have always known them. I had done it to battles and coronations, to Geralt's contracts, even to my own mishaps when I wanted to seem more charming and less foolish. What unsettled me was the sense that this time I was arriving late to my own craft. Someone else had taken up the quill and was already writing over the memories. In marketplaces, I saw cheap pamphlets with crude woodcuts. A woman rising from stylized waves, hair drawn like a halo, sword held rigidly above her head. In temples, priests spoke of her as a sign from whatever higher power they happened to serve most profitably that season. Children played games where one of them stood in a puddle and solemnly declared another chosen by the lady. Once, in a city whose name I choose not to recall, a drunk stopped me in the street and asked whether I had heard of the maiden beneath the nearby river who rewarded pure hearts. I told him that pure hearts were rarer than dry boots in a spring flood. He laughed and clapped me on the back, hearing only a joke. Perhaps you know this feeling. You return to a place that once mattered to you and find that the bakery has become a pawn shop. The quiet square now holds a monument to a stranger. The familiar bench has vanished beneath a stall selling boiled sausages. The shell of the place remains, but the meaning has shifted just enough to hurt. That is how it felt listening to those rumours. They spoke of a girl emerging from water, yet I could not find Cirilla in them, no matter how I strained my ears. Ciri was many things when I knew her. A half-starved child in rags, laughing with her mouth full of stolen stew. A sullen teenager sharpening her sword a little too loudly, as if grinding steel could drown out the ache of abandonment. A whirlwind on horseback, reckless and alive, hurling herself at the world because standing still hurt more. None of those shapes fit neatly into the calm, ceremonial figure from these tales. The one who appears only to utter a few polished words, bestow a shining weapon, and sink back into obedient, mirror-smooth water. Still, I listened. A bard must collect material, even when it tastes like ashes. Often, after a particularly elaborate account, I would walk to whatever lake or river the locals had pointed to, and sit alone on the bank. Water, at least, does not lie. It simply reflects. It is astonishing how quickly human eyes begin to project faces onto its shifting skin, how easily we mistake our own wanting for revelation. A few reeds, a ripple, a glint of light, and the heart whispers that it has seen a sign. There were evenings when I almost believed the stories myself. The surface would darken. A breeze would slide across it like a careful hand, and for a moment I would see her there, waist deep, hair plastered to her cheeks, smirking at me. Not the serene lady of the ballads, but Ciri, irritated that I had once again surrendered to melodrama. "Get up, Dandelion," she would tell me, without moving her lips. "The world does not need another legend. It needs someone to remember who froze, who trembled, who lied, who chose." Then the image would break, and I would be left with nothing but ripples and the sound of my own breathing. On such nights, I pulled my cloak tighter and forced my thoughts toward ordinary things. A warm loaf cupped in both hands, a simple tune played in a half-empty tavern, the way candle wax gathers at the base of a wick before it spills. These are the small anchors that hold a life in place when miracles arrive late or never. You have your own list, I am sure. The chipped cup you always reach for, the short walk that steadies you, the familiar key that fits the same stubborn lock every evening. You might ask why any of this matters. If people find comfort in the image of a radiant woman rising from the depths to grant them purpose, is that not harmless? Perhaps it is for most. But we still wonder whether a legend polished that smooth does not also erase the stubborn, imperfect girl behind it, the one who bled and cursed and hesitated, yet still kept moving when every sensible soul would have stayed safely on the shore. There is a particular kind of night that belongs only to travellers and fools, too late for honest work, too early for tavern songs. The roads empty, the air thins, and the world feels folded in half. I have spent many such nights on the move, cloak pulled tight, hoping the next village would be kinder than the last. When Ciri's path bent toward the lake called Quaum Plocka, she was not hoping for anything at all. She was simply trying to keep going. I must say it clearly, I was not there. I did not stand on that shore or hear the first clink of armour. What I know comes from fragments gathered long after. Sorceress visions, a knight's confused report, scattered notes by scholars who like to peer at fate through a magnifying glass. Yet there is a stubborn agreement among these crooked sources. One learns, with time, to distinguish the bright polish of invention from the duller, persistent gleam of truth. Picture her, then, as I have pieced her together. Rain had withdrawn, but left its memory everywhere. The ground was soft, the air tasted of iron and wet stone. Quam Puckiao was no grand sacred mirror from a courtly tapestry. It was a hollow in the hills, rimmed with scrub and crooked trees, its surface restless with reeds and insects. The sort of place the world grows, when nobody expects miracles. Out of that ordinary bleakness stepped a girl who carried more worlds inside her than the sky above. She had ridden hard before reaching the lake, fled harder, and fallen through more than one crack in reality. Her clothes bore the story, leather scuffed and torn, cloak spotted with old mud and newer blood, boots that had known too many roads. Her hair, that ash-white banner so beloved in paintings, was tangled and damp, braided in places, loose in others, as if she had tried to tame it while running, and then abandoned the attempt. She approached the edge of the water and for a time did nothing at all. No heroic pose, no ritual gesture. She simply stood and looked. Perhaps she saw her reflection, perhaps she saw only darkness. We like to imagine that in such moments destiny leans close and whispers. I suspect she heard mostly the hissing of reeds and the slow drip of water from her own sleeves. Her sword, battered by more than one desperate fight, hung at her side, its weight a familiar accusation. Somewhere beyond the rim of the hollow, hooves rang lightly on stone. The knight was late to his own legend, or perhaps she was early. Their meeting had been promised in more than one prophecy, though none had included directions or a sensible schedule. When I imagine Galahad riding toward that lake, guided by half-remembered verses, I cannot help feeling a stab of pity. The poor man had no idea that the story he was entering had already broken 3 or 4 times and been hastily knotted back together. He came down the slope slowly, armour gleaming where it could, dulled where travel had scuffed the polish away. His horse snorted at the smell of the water. Galahad himself was as close to the picture of a knight as flesh can manage. Young, earnest, carrying his faith around him like a second suit of mail. He had crossed seas in search of a figure from his homeland's legends, a lady in the lake who would grant him a sign, a sword, a purpose worthy of the songs he had grown up hearing. Instead, he found a soaked, wary girl who eyed him the way street children eye guardsmen, ready to bolt, ready to fight, not ready to trust. Here the stories diverge. In some, she greeted him with a line polished for ballads, full of solemn promise. In others, she threw out something sharp and impatient, the verbal equivalent of flicking mud from a boot. Knowing her, I think the truth leans toward the second. Ciri was capable of grace, but but not on command, not when every bone in her body was still vibrating from flight. What matters is not the exact words, but the shift that took place between them. Galahad, to his credit, did not flee, did not raise his blade, did not demand that the universe be neater than it was. He looked at her properly, not at the halo of legend flickering around her outline, but at the tired curve of her shoulders, the scars at the edges of her gloves, the way her hand hovered near her hilt, more from habit than threat. Something in his expectations cracked then. That was when the meeting truly began. She told him her name, Cirilla, Ciri. Perhaps she added none of the titles the world had stuck to it. Perhaps, out of a weariness deeper than the lake, she listed them all at once to see whether he would flinch. She told him, too, or began to tell him, where she had come from, not from beneath this water, but from cities that no longer stood as she remembered them, from a hidden keep in the mountains, from the dust of far southern roads. The chroniclers speak of the air tightening around Quamplocka as they talked. Time there has always been peculiar. Some call it a wound, others a knot, others a hinge on which several realities swing. However you name it, the same images return in the accounts. Mist thickening yet holding shapes. Stars overhead brightening as if they too leaned down to listen. Ciri, who had wandered from world to world with the unicorn Ihwaraquaxi, felt everything under her shift again. Until that night, her path had been only escape. She had slipped from the hands of elves who wanted to turn her into a vessel for their cold dreams, from bounty hunters and slavers, from kings and mages who saw in her blood a convenient key. At the edge of this unremarkable lake, the prospect of a different kind of journey appeared. Not gentler, not safer, but different. It would be guided not solely by those who wished to use her, but by something quieter, the slow turning of stories themselves. By speaking to Galahad, Ciri began to narrate her own life. She took back the thread from prophets and schemers and held it, however briefly, between her own fingers. She chose which episodes to mention, which to skip, which to cover with sarcasm, so their pain did not shine too brightly. Anyone who has ever tried to explain themselves to a stranger knows that this choosing is its own kind of magic. I like to think that as she spoke and he listened, the lake grew calmer, not because any higher power had been appeased, but because two very human beings were for a moment doing something our world rarely allows, meeting without masks sharpened for war or seduction. A knight who expected a symbol found instead a person. A girl who expected another trap found, instead, a reasonably attentive pair of ears. From their meeting, the legends will take only a few ornaments. They will remember the armor the sword held out, the polished phrases some later bard will put into their mouths. They will forget the chill seeping into her boots, the itch under his collar, the way silence stretched between questions. They will erase the small, unremarkable humanity that made the encounter real. Yet we still wonder whether it was precisely those small, awkward moments that saved them both that night. He from drowning in ideals, and she from drowning in despair. Elves have always been generous to poets, at least in the imagination. In songs written by people who have never met one, they are all luminous eyes and effortless wisdom, gliding through forests without so much as disturbing a leaf. Even in my more honest ballads, I have sometimes made them prettier, kinder, more tragic than they deserve. It is easy to do when you only see them from the outside, framed by distance. It is much harder when you picture one of your own standing in their world as something between a guest and a captive. Ciri's path into the realm of the NL was not a graceful crossing between equal courts. She did not step through some ceremonial arch with banners fluttering, honoured as an envoy. She stumbled there like someone missing a stair in the dark. One moment she was fleeing, the next she was surrounded by air that smelled of unfamiliar flowers and a sky crowded with foreign constellations. This is how the sources describe it, and something in their fumbling words convinces me more than any polished epic. Tir Nalaya, their city, has been painted and repainted by hands more talented than mine. Tall towers of glass, or something like glass, silver trees that never shed their leaves, bridges as slender as wishes. I have seen sketches where the streets curve like strands of light, everything bathed in a pale glow that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Beautiful, yes, undeniably, but beauty is an untrustworthy witness. It rarely tells you who owns the keys to the doors. She arrived there under the guidance of Avalark, sage of the NL, scholar of Elderblood, a figure human academics love to argue about. In some treatises he is honoured as a patron of knowledge, in others condemned as a cold strategist. Personally, I think both are true. He understood more about the tangled heritage in Ciri's veins than any of us, and he valued that heritage far more than the frightened girl who carried it. He clothed her in fine fabrics, gave her rooms that opened onto glittering balconies, and never forgot for a moment that he had not brought home a person, but a plan. Then there was Oberon, king of that other world. The accounts agree on his presence the way they agree on the moon. Remote, enchanting, pulling at the tides of everyone around him. He was centuries old and carried that age with a fragile pride, like a cloak worn thin but still displayed because it once turned heads. To him, Ciri was a necessary chapter in an ancient design, the latest piece in a long attempt to shape a child whose power could crack worlds. He spoke of destiny the way some men speak of vintage wine, savouring the sound of the word more than its contents. In Tir Nalaya, Ciri was offered a role instead of chains. Sometimes that is the subtler prison. No fetters clanked when she moved. Instead, there were silks, carved furniture, terraces where the light fell just so across shining stone. Servants came and went with quiet efficiency. Avalark spoke to her as one might address a valuable instrument being tuned for a grand performance. Oberon drifted in and out of her days like a weary actor, reciting old lines about duty and blood. There is a particular cruelty in being told that everything is happening for your own good when every part of you is shrinking back. Ciri had been chased, beaten, hunted before, yet this new captivity wrapped itself in courtesy. She was asked rather than dragged, persuaded rather than shoved, praised for qualities she had never chosen. That kind of kindness can feel worse than open hostility, because it demands your gratitude even as it narrows your world. If you have ever sat through a conversation where every compliment felt like a leash, you know a little of what she endured. The teacher who insists you are gifted only as long as you follow their path. The superior who calls you family but expects your time without limit, the relative who smiles as they arrange your future on your behalf. We dress these cages in familiar words. The NL used more ornate phrases and longer lives, yet the structure was the same. From her balconies, Ciri could see the riders who had become legend in our world as the Wild Hunt. To the NL, they were simply cavalry, disciplined and proud, their horses' hooves ringing on white stone, armor catching the thin light. She watched Eredin, their commander, move among them, a figure of sharp edges and quiet menace. He too looked at her and saw more symbol than person. She had already ridden in his wake once, torn through human skies as an unwilling omen. The memory must have lain in her like a bruise that would not fade. The chronicles speak of evenings when Oberon summoned her to walk beside him in gardens that never knew winter. They shared fruit that glowed faintly in the gloom, drank wine that tasted of distant rain. He spoke of a child they were meant to conceive, one who would bear the concentrated strength of elder blood. This was presented as fulfillment, as the completion of patterns begun long before either of them drew breath. Yet beneath the poetry lay an ugly arithmetic. Her body added to his lineage would equal power. There are moments described almost timidly by those who recorded them. Oberon, ancient and burdened, could not simply step into the role expected of him. Age and doubt had hollowed out spaces in him that no ritual or potion could fill. Ciri, caught between revulsion and reluctant pity, tried once to lighten the scene, offering him strong drink, coaxing some ember of life from a tired king who had spent too long worshipping a design drawn by others. The attempt ended not in triumph, nor in the neat conclusion the NL desired, but in a quiet, confused tragedy, by the bedside of a man who could no longer pretend he believed in the purpose assigned to him. When news of Oberon's death seeped through the shining corridors, it did so without wailing. The elves folded the event into their long view of time, already adjusting their schemes. For Ciri, the loss was strange and immediate. She had not loved him, yet his faltering exposed the hollowness at the heart of the prison built around her. If even the king at its centre could not fully embrace the role destiny had written, what did that say about the story she was being pushed into? Avalark's courtesy grew thinner after that. The velvet on the bars began to fray. Eredin's interest sharpened. The girl who was meant to be a vessel suddenly became a liability that might decide to spill in an inconvenient direction. Reports mention new guards at her doors, new constraints wrapped in polite language. She smiled less. She walked the terraces with tighter shoulders. Somewhere in those bright, airless days, the thought of escape must have stopped being a wild wish and become a quiet, deliberate plan. I imagine her standing once more at a high balcony, the city of Tir Nalia spreading out below like a dream carved in light and stone. From a distance, it must have looked perfect. Up close, she could see the hairline cracks, the places where habit had replaced hope. Perfection, like captivity, is easier to see from the outside than from within. But we still wonder whether the most dangerous prisons are not made of glass or spell or steel, but of admiration and expectation, the ones that tell you over and over that you are chosen, so long as you agree never to choose for yourself. Some roads are drawn with ink, others are scratched in dust and forgotten with the next wind. The path Ciri took after leaving the realm of the NL was of a third kind entirely, a sequence of doors flung open in the fabric of the world, so brief that only hooves and terror could squeeze through. No cartographer will ever sketch that journey. Only unicorns and a few anxious sorcerers remember how the turns were taken. I have never ridden a unicorn. I say this with some regret. It sounds like the kind of eccentricity that would look well in a biography. But no, my mounts have always been stubborn horses with more opinion than speed. Unicorns do not tolerate men like me. They are choosy. They prefer children, the desperate, and those who stand at the edge of something too big for them. In Ciri, they found all three. Ihwaraquaxtri saying that after 3 glasses of wine was not a docile steed conjured for a single noble gesture. He was kin to the unicorns who had shadowed her since the desert, since Korath and the sun that wanted to burn the world clean. There was a debt of sorts between them, though neither would have used so dull a word. He appeared when the walls of Tir na Lir had begun to tighten, when Avalak's politeness had sharpened and Eredin's gaze had grown hungrier. One night, as thin clouds smeared the sky above the elven city, she found him waiting in a place where he had no right to be, a stable that held no other beasts, on stone that remembered no hoofprints. The witnesses who peer into such things speak of the smell first. Not hay, not sweat, but something like cold metal after lightning, sharp and clean. Then the outline took shape. A body as lean as a racing horse, coat pale as mist, mane stirred by a breeze that was not there. The horn, slender and spiraled, looked at once solid and unreal, as if it had been sketched over the world in a line no one else could see. His eyes, when they met hers, held no human softness. They held recognition, impatience, and the steady question only true companions ever ask, "Will you move your feet or not?" There was no time for speeches. Ciri climbed onto his back because every other direction had closed. Perhaps she hesitated for the length of a breath, thinking of all the places she had still not escaped, all the faces that might be waiting behind the next threshold. Then Ihwaraquax moved, and the stable, the palace, the city and its glass towers all tore away like scenery in a travelling theatre. Crossing between worlds is, I am told, indescribable. That has not stopped many from trying. Pages of theory speak of spheres brushing, of coordinates of power. The testimonies of those who have actually done it sound simpler. A pressure in the bones, a taste of iron behind the teeth, light folding the wrong way. For Ciri, who carried elder blood like a blade inside her, the transit was both passage and echo. Every leap stirred old scars in her, as if the paths had been waiting since long before her birth. They emerged first into a world of frozen breath. Snow lay in soft heaps across an open plain, lit by a sky the colour of tarnished silver. The cold was not the familiar bite of a northern winter, but something stranger, as if warmth here was an awkward guest. Ciri's lungs protested, her fingers stiffened on the unicorn's mane, but Ihwaraquax barely slowed. In the distance she glimpsed shapes that might have been trees, might have been spears of ice. No birds called, only their hoofbeats, muffled by snow, marked their existence. Then the air snapped sideways, and the plain was gone. Sand grabbed at them instead, each grain hot, the sky a white glare. For a heartbeat, Ciri thought she had been thrown back into the Korath, that vast, merciless desert where she had once crawled with a cracked tongue and eyes full of blood. But this was different. The dunes were lower. The wind carried a tang of some distant sea. Still, her throat clenched with remembered thirst. Unicorns are not sentimental. Ihwaraquax did not linger to let her sort past from present. Again the world lurched, and the sand fell away. They burst out onto a slope of blackened stone overlooking a dead city. Houses sagged into themselves like weary men. Windows stared with empty sockets. A smell of old sickness clung to everything, tenacious and sour. Ciri saw carts abandoned mid-street, doors barred from inside that had never been opened again. Somewhere a bell swung slowly in a wind that could not decide which way to blow. I have read that in this place a plague had once eaten the numbers out of calendars, leaving people unsure which year had died with them. Ciri urged Ihwaraquax on, or perhaps he urged her. Accounts differ. Either way, they did not stay. I take some comfort in that. There are worlds where even a girl who has seen as much as she had will not dismount. And on they went. A shore of black glass where waves rolled soundlessly, leaving no foam. A forest whose trees had metal for bark, and leaves the colour of embers. A valley under a low, throbbing sky where skeletal towers reached up like fingers, catching crackles of invisible fire. Each world flashed past like a card in a drunken conjurer's trick. Ciri clung, squinted, clenched her jaw against nausea. Her body travelled one path, her heart another, racing in circles around a simple, burning wish, to find a place where no one knew her name, or at least where no one wanted to use it as a spell. If this all sounds too grand, think of a simpler image. Think of a child running through rooms during a thunderstorm, slamming doors behind them not because the lightning is following, but because the noise inside their own chest is louder than any thunder. Ciri's flight across the worlds was like that, only stretched over distances that break maps. Now and then, in the spaces between leaps, she and Ihwaraquax had moments almost like conversation. Unicorn speech is not made of words, nor is it the soft, sentimental communion. Romantic poets enjoy inventing. It is closer to the exchange between two creatures who have shared the same edge of disaster and remember it without embroidery. A flash of image, the pressure of an emotion, a refusal to pity. He showed her paths she had not guessed were there. She showed him, in return, that humans could keep moving long after they should have stopped. From my chair by the window, years and worlds away, I cannot help adding my human comparisons. To me, their journey sounds like that period after an ill-advised decision when you keep changing taverns, streets, cities, hoping the consequences will tire of chasing you. You know the feeling, perhaps in gentler form. The restless evening when you scroll through plans, invitations, half-finished tasks, unable to settle. The difference is scale, not essence. Most of us run in circles inside one world. She had too many to choose from. Eventually, inevitably, the chase behind them thickened. The riders of the wild hunt, those same elven cavalrymen, turned in our tales to wraiths in the sky, began to nip at their heels again. To them, she was still a prize, still a key, still a moving target in a game older than human kingdoms. The unicorns, for their part, had reasons of their own to keep her out of certain hands, and so the path that had seemed like pure escape curled slowly back toward the tangled skein of her fate. There are hints in the visions of certain mages, in Nimue's dreams and Condwiramer's delicate drawings, that during this time Ciri brushed against our own world's future, or perhaps some cousin of it. They speak of roads where metal beasts roared, of towers aflame with pointillist lights. She did not stay there either. Perhaps every world she touched in that flight was wrong in some small decisive way. Yet we still wonder whether, in skipping from one reality to the next, with unicorn hooves beating time beneath her, Ciri was truly running away, or secretly circling closer to some door she had not yet dared to recognize as home. Every saga has a place that pretends war is a rumor. For us, that place was Toussaint. If the world were a table laid for guests, Toussaint would be the shiny fruit bowl in the center, carefully arranged so no one notices the cracked plates near the edge. Vines heavy with grapes, rivers that seemed to run on diluted wine, hills soft as pillows, and castles that looked as though they had been painted there by a sentimental hand. I knew Toussaint before Geralt went there on his last great wanderings. I had sung under those balconies, dodged thrown flowers and the occasional thrown shoe, and I had learned that nothing in that duchy is ever simply what it seems. Knights there duel at the slightest provocation, yet they quote poetry as they do it. Ladies faint on cue, then rise with eyes shrewd enough to price a man's future in one glance. The air is scented with roses, but if you listen closely, you can hear the rustle of paperwork as stewards count barrels and taxes behind the scenes. By the time Geralt arrived, world-weary and scarred in more places than he cared to count, Toussaint was ready for him. Not for Geralt the person, for the idea of a witcher. A land of chivalric fancies is always hungry for a new monster slayer with a suitably tragic silhouette. He came in company, that strange fellowship he had gathered around him on the road. Milva with her bow and fierce silence, Cahir still wrapped in the shadow of his old armour even when he wore no steel. Regis with his calm that always seemed to hide both more and less than he showed. They carried dust on their boots and grief in their pockets, even when laughter crept between them. Toussaint saw only the outlines and filled them in with its own colours. The Duchess, Anna Henrietta, welcomed Geralt with all her complicated heart. She knew him already. Our earlier misadventures in her domain could fill another volume, preferably one hidden at the back of a library where her courtiers could not find it. She was quick-tempered and warm, as likely to shout as to stroke a cheek, proud of her vineyards and her poets and her illusions. To her, Geralt was both an old wound and an old temptation, a reminder that there were lives beyond the careful rituals of court, lives where one could ride out without a retinue and return with stories no herald would approve. So what did Toussaint offer to a tired witcher and his worn companions? Comfort, of course. The deep, drowsy kind that seeps into the joints and makes armour feel heavier when you finally put it back on. There were banquets, hunts, tours of the vineyards where each row of vines had a story attached to it. There were masked balls where the music swelled and the torches blurred, and for a few hours one could pretend that monsters were nothing more than masks that would be taken off at dawn. And there was Fringilla Vigo. I met Fringilla once, long ago. Dark hair, eyes that seemed to calculate and soften at the same time, a smile that could cut or cradle, depending on the angle. In the stories that reached me later, she entered Geralt's Toussaint days like a shadow cast by the torchlight of all that beauty. She was the lodge's representative in that bright duchy, a sorceress with her own errands to run, her own nets to cast. Yet she could be charming, and more than that, she could be kind in ways that did not look like traps at first glance. Geralt had been spending his strength for too long, on battlefields, in alleys, in arguments with kings and queens who asked him to choose sides in games he did not design. In Toussaint he found, for a short time, something that resembled rest. Days filled with work that, if not simple, at least felt straightforward. A monster here, a mystery there. The familiar satisfaction of a task that ended with someone grateful and a purse heavy enough to pay for repairs. Nights filled with music and wine, and the warmth of a woman who seemed to understand that he needed silence as much as conversation. To a bard, such a phase in a hero's life is tempting material. The quiet middle act, the gentle interlude, the breath before the plunge. It is easy to paint it in soft strokes and linger over sunlit vineyards, over Geralt's tired face, easing into something almost like peace. It is just as easy, if one wishes to be clever, to scoff and call it delusion. A lullaby whispered over a battlefield that has not yet been cleaned. I try to resist both impulses, because there was truth in Geralt's rest. Broken men do sometimes find corners of safety. Soldiers do sometimes lay their heads down on embroidered pillows. It does not make their wounds less real. It does not make their past vanish. It simply means that for a season they can measure time in glasses of wine, poured rather than enemies counted. For Milva, Cahir, Regis, and the others, Toussaint provided a strange kind of shelter, a place where their scars were touched more often by curiosity than by fear. I imagine them walking through the markets, watching children play at knights and dragons with sticks and painted shields, feeling something twist inside. They knew real knights, real dragons, real battles. They knew that armor rusts and dragons bleed, and that the smell of a battlefield stays in your clothes long after you wash them. Yet they also knew that without the games in the streets, without the stories told in safety, no one would remember why any of it had happened. In the evenings, when the last song had faded and the candles had been pinched out, Geralt would lie awake beside Fringilla and feel the pull of two worlds inside himself. One was this, warm, scented, slow, a place where he could be a lover and a guest and a curiosity. The other lay beyond the duchy's borders, cold, sharp, unfinished. Ciri was out there somewhere. Yennefer too. Their absence stretched between his thoughts like a long, unhealed stitch. Fringilla understood this more than she let on. She had been asked to keep him, to distract him, to wrap his doubts in silk. She did it with more tenderness than her employers had expected, which only complicated the knot. If you have ever lingered too long in a pleasant diversion while a harder duty waited in the next room, you know a little of what gnawed at him. You tell yourself that one more evening will not matter, that you think more clearly with a full belly and a rested head, that the world will surely wait one more day before asking for your answer. It is a kind of spell we cast on ourselves, with cushions, instead of candles, with excuses instead of incantations. The truth is that Toussaint did not change Geralt so much as reveal something the rest of the world had no use for. He was capable of appreciating beauty, of enjoying a good wine and a witty remark, of laughing at a ridiculous tournament where knights in elaborate armour crashed into one another for the right to wear a ribbon. Underneath the gruff exterior lay a man who could, for a little while, accept being cared for. That is perhaps the most frightening thing for someone whose identity has been forged entirely in hardship. When the time finally came to leave, it was not marked by a grand revelation. No trumpet sounded from the clouds. It was simply that the lies grew too heavy, even the gentle ones. News seeped in from beyond the borders. Names resurfaced. The world, which Toussaint had kept politely at arm's length, pushed its face against the glass. Geralt drank, argued, walked the vineyards, and understood that every step he took on that soft soil was a step taken away from the girl he had promised to protect. The duchy remained what it had always been, a theatre where people insisted on happy endings as a matter of etiquette. Geralt and his companions rode away carrying something they had not brought with them, the memory of a peace that had never truly been theirs. It is a strange burden to remember how comfort feels when you know you are riding straight back into storm. But we still wonder whether those days among the vines and roses gave them a thin, fragile thread of warmth to hold in their fists later, when there was nothing around them but cold stone and the echo of iron on iron. There are people who enter a life like a door banging open in a storm. Yennefer was like that. You always knew when she was near, even with your eyes closed. Fringilla entered differently. With her, it was as if someone had drawn a curtain, soft and heavy, between you and the rest of the world. The noise quieted. The light changed. Only later did you ask who had closed the window. The Lodge of Sorceresses knew what they were doing when they sent Fringilla Vigo to Toussaint. You must understand this. Nothing about her presence there was accidental. They needed a way to keep Geralt from charging toward Nilfgaard, from finding Ciri too soon, from becoming an unpredictable piece on their careful board. To that end, they chose a woman who could do what few others could, make a witcher forget, for a little while, that his life was built on leaving. I did not sit in the councils where such decisions were made. I heard about them later, filtered through letters half-burned, through the guilty sighs of women who had once been girls dancing to the tune of older mages. Still, even from a distance, the pattern is clear enough. Fringilla was to be comfort and distraction, a pillow laid quietly over the face of Geralt's restlessness. To say she succeeded would be both true and unfair. True, because Geralt stayed, for longer than any of us would have predicted. He hunted monsters around Toussaint, drank its wine, slept in its feather beds and in Fringilla's arms. Unfair, because she did not simply act a part written by others. She added her own lines. She was, inconveniently for everyone involved, a real person. In the evenings, I imagine them together in one of those high rooms with stone cool even in summer, candles on the table, a carafe of dense red wine breathing on the sideboard. Outside, the noise of the court reduced to murmurs, laughter carried faintly by the wind. Fringilla pouring 2 cups, her hands steady. Geralt unbuckling his armour piece by piece, each clasp a small act of trust and fatigue. They spoke, I am sure, of ordinary things as well as grave matters. How the vines were faring that year, which knight had distinguished himself that morning by falling off his horse with particular style, whether the new vintner understood anything about the barrel he was tapping. Such conversations are the rope bridges that carry us from one day to the next without looking down. Sorceresses and witches need them as much as bakers do, yet beneath the everyday talk, other currents slid. Fringilla knew of the lodge's designs, of the subtle spellwork woven not only into the air but into her instructions. There were enchantments of influence, yes, light as spider threads, meant to soften Geralt's resolve, nudge his thoughts away from journeys northward, from the girl with ash-white hair and the woman with violet eyes. But the most effective charm she cast required no formula. It was simple presence, repeated night after night, until habit began to grow where once there had been only restlessness. From all I have heard, she did something rare among those who wield power. She listened. Geralt is not a talkative man. You must drag words from him like stones from deep ground. But even the most closed lips part a little when they believe the listener will not twist what they hear. Fringilla asked scarcely any questions. She let the silence do its work, and into that silence he dropped fragments. Names, places, regrets. He may even have mentioned me, though I doubt he omitted my worst rhymes. She began, despite herself, to care. There is the awkward truth. The lodge had given her a tool. She turned it, perhaps, into a relationship. Not a storybook romance, not the volcanic entanglement that had existed between Geralt and Yennefer, but something more muted, a companionship woven from shared fatigue and borrowed time. You might think this less noble than burning passion. I am not so sure. There is a special bravery in offering tenderness to someone who is only ever partly with you. Fringilla knew that some corner of Geralt's mind was always leaning toward the north, toward the memory of other arms, other promises. She knew that a witch's life comes with no warranties, only abrupt departures. Yet she poured the wine, warmed his bed, sat with him when the nightmares came. In doing so, she stepped further and further from the script the lodge had written. Geralt, for his part, is guilty too. Of what? Of wanting quiet, of letting himself sink into the soft depths of life in Toussaint, into Fringilla's measured affection, while elsewhere Ciri ran and bled, and wondered why the world was so slow to keep its word. He accepted the curtain she held up between him and the wider world, even knowing there were shadows behind it. That perhaps was his greatest failure in that season. Not any blow struck or not struck, but the blows he did not hurry to prevent. Do not be too quick to condemn him, or rather, if you must, remember the times you have done something similar in smaller ways. Have you never delayed a difficult conversation for the sake of one more peaceful evening? Never postponed a necessary change because the current discomfort was, at least, familiar? We all have our Toussaints, jobs we linger in too long, relationships we know will not last, but cling to, because they are kinder than the emptiness waiting on the road. There came a day when the weave of enchantments and compromises began to fray. Messages arrived. Rumours grew too loud to ignore. The names Ciri and Yennefer passed through Toussaint like cold draughts under a closed door. Fringilla felt the change in him the way one feels a shift in weather in the bones. He returned from a hunt more distant. He looked out over the vineyards and no longer saw the charming patterns of rows and terraces. Only the borders, only the roads leading away. I do not know exactly what words passed between them when he told her he would leave. I suspect they were neither dramatic nor cruel. Geralt is clumsy with farewells, but he rarely lies outright. Perhaps he said he had to go north. Perhaps he simply began packing, and she, being no fool, understood that the little spell Toussaint had cast on him was breaking. She could have tried stronger magic. Instead, she let him choose. That choice cost her more than the lodge had ever intended her to pay. In the end, what remains of that season between them is not the manipulation written in the margins of histories, but the quieter, more human residue. A witcher who discovered he could still be held without bristling. A sorceress who learned that following orders can be more dangerous to the heart than defying them. Two people who shared a stolen pause in a world rushing toward catastrophe. From my distant vantage point, turning these memories and second-hand accounts over like old coins, I find I cannot decide whether their time together should be counted as a sin, a kindness, or a little of both. But we still wonder whether those borrowed nights in Toussaint were a betrayal of the girl on the run, or a fragile rehearsal that taught a weary man how to care enough to face the pain that awaited him on the road ahead. If Toussaint was a painted theatre set, then Nilfgaard was the machinery behind the stage. Pulleys, counterweights, ropes black with sweat. From above, in neat maps, the empire looks simple enough. A black sun on gold, an eagle's shadow spreading over conquered lands. Up close, it smells of hot metal, ink, and the faint sourness of fear people pretend not to notice. By the time Geralt was resting among vineyards, the court in Nilfgaard had turned Ciri into something between a banner and a bargaining chip. Not the real girl, of course. The real Cirilla was running with unicorns, slipping out of elven cages, stumbling toward lakes with unpronounceable names. The Ciri at Emir var Emreis's side had a different origin. She had been picked, polished, and pressed into the shape the empire required. We call her the false Ciri, because it is convenient. History likes labels. Yet she was as real as you or I. A young woman taken from poverty, from some borderland village where grain and rumour both grew thin, then remade by tailors, tutors, and the quiet brutality of etiquette. They straightened her back, taught her to speak with a Cintran lilt, filled her head with the names of dead relatives who were never hers. When she walked through the palace, courtiers bowed not to the person, but to the story stitched around her. Emir himself is not a man one describes easily. I have seen him only at a distance, striding through reports, glimpsed in the reflections of those who served or opposed him. He was once Dunny, the hedgehog knight cursed and freed and entangled in destinies that led him far from the northern halls that had first known him. By the time he sat on the Nilfgaardian throne, he had learned to clench his past like a knife hidden in his sleeve. He loved order the way some men love hunting, believing in plans that spanned years, in treaties and betrayals arranged like stones on a board. For such a man, Ciri was never only a daughter. She was a hinge between north and south, old prophecy and new policy, private guilt and public ambition. The girl at his court, the false Ciri, allowed him to close doors he could not bear to leave ajar. With her on his arm, he could say to the world that the matter of Cintra was settled. The promise made long ago had been fulfilled. The child of destiny was safely under imperial care. In the privacy of his chambers, perhaps he said it to himself as well, hoping the words would grow true with repetition. Around him moved men like Stephen Skellen, called Tawny Owl, a clever, dangerous creature always half in shadow. His eyes measured angles others missed. To ambitious officers like him, the false Ciri was a sign that the Emperor could be deceived, or at least that even Emir had blind spots. Blind spots invite hands. Fingers reached for threads in secret, tugging here, loosening there. Nilfgaard's famous unity was, like many grand facades, held together by quieter rivalries behind it. I sometimes picture the imperial palace as Yare must have imagined it when he copied the accounts into his notes. Yare was a scribe, a former novice from a northern temple, dragged south not by choice, but by the tide of war. In camps and hospitals he wrote what others were too busy bleeding or healing to record. He never saw Nilfgaard with his own eyes, yet he reconstructed its corridors with ink based on reports that passed through commanders' hands. High ceilings, black and gold banners, floors polished until they reflected every misstep, guards who looked straight ahead unless they were sure no one was watching. At Brenna, he served as a scribe to a halfling surgeon named Rusty, filling pages I would one day spread out on my own table. From him I learned how much of history is written by those who are simply trying to keep up, scratching lines between screams. From his perspective, the Empire was not a grand silhouette, but a list of supplies, orders, casualty reports bearing the imperial seal. Emir's strategies arrived in neat packets, escorted by officers who smelled of foreign soap and overconfidence. The false Ciri appeared there only as a line in a rumour. The Emperor has his princess now. The marriage is a matter of time. The North will have to bow or break. Facts, half-facts, wishes disguised as news. Yara wrote them down, underlining the ones that contradicted yesterday's claims. What strikes me now, reading his cramped handwriting, is how often he left blank spaces. Places where he knew something mattered, but did not yet know what it was. Those gaps feel more honest than any proclamation I ever heard from a throne. Emir's court, for all its decrees, lived with such gaps too. No one dared say aloud that the girl walking beside the Emperor was not the child foretold. Yet that unspoken truth ran under every banquet like a crack under tiling. In the great hall, the false Ciri learned to smile when addressed as princess, to nod when told of Cintra's glorious past, to accept the weight of a crown that had once cut grooves into another girl's forehead. Somewhere in her private mind, a different story must have played. The one about who she had been before, a daughter perhaps, or a sister, someone who had fetched water and scraped pans and dreamed, if she dared, of something beyond the next harvest. No one at court asked for that story. They were all too busy rehearsing the lines they needed her to say. There is a sort of cruelty that does not raise its voice. It speaks instead in corrections. Your posture, your grammar, your memories. You are gently guided away from yourself until one day you look in the mirror and see only the role. I think often of that girl in the imperial palace. not because she was a symbol of Emir's false settlement with his past, but because she was a person whose own past was stripped from her, layer by layer, in the name of higher designs. If this all sounds far from our small, ordinary lives, look closer. We too crown false versions of people every day. The ideal child, the perfect colleague, the lover we imagine instead of the one before us. We press them into roles, then grow angry when they do not fit. We rename them with our expectations. We turn them into symbols of what we want resolved. But we still wonder whether an empire can ever be truly secure when it rests not on the thin shoulders of a living girl, but on the hollow comfort of a story everyone pretends to believe and no one dares to tell in full. I did not stand on the field at Brenna with a sword in my hand. I have no scars from that day, no stories of how I stared an enemy in the eye and saw my own reflection. My part in the Battle of Brenna came later, at a table with a stack of notes and a heart that tightened a little more with every page I turned. Perhaps that makes me unfit to speak of it. Perhaps it makes me the only kind of witness such days truly deserve. The songs that sprang up afterwards were inevitable. They always are. Brave banners, shining steel, clever generals whose plans unfolded like flawless poems. In some of those ballads, Brenna became a neat turning point. The north holds, Nilfgaard falters, the tide shifts. People like their history arranged in tidy couplets. It helps them sleep. It fills the silences between flagons. I sang a few of those pieces myself, I admit, when coin was scarce and audiences wanted something to clap to. But the Brenna I learned from Yara and from Rusty's reports looked very different. It smelled less of glory and more of mud, sweat, and the sharp tang of herbs boiled in water that never had enough time to cool. Yara was young then. He had been a temple novice once, more used to copying scripture than the names of regiments, more familiar with quiet cloisters than with fields churned by marching boots. Somehow he found his way into Rusty's field hospital, a cluster of tents near the river, where the halfling surgeon worked from dawn until whatever came after dawn when the sky refused to change colour. If you had walked into that camp on the morning of the battle, you might have mistaken it for any other gathering of travellers. Pots bubbling over low fires, men and women stretching their backs, adjusting bandages, telling jokes that fell flat because their mouths were too dry. The real difference lay in the neatness of Rusty's instruments and the way Yara stacked his papers, trying to impose order on the day before it unravelled. From their vantage point, Brenna was not a broad sweep of formations seen from a hillside. It was a series of arrivals. The first injured came in almost shyly, as if they were apologizing for being early. A scratch here, a twisted ankle there. Yara noted their names, the units they came from, the brief comments Rusty muttered as he worked. Large man, small injury, will complain later. Sent back to the line. As the day thickened, so did the flow. Tents filled. Bedrolls appeared on the ground where there had been clear space before. The air grew heavy, and not only from the heat. Yara's handwriting, steady at first, grew hurried, then cramped. Lines began to curl into one another as he tried to fit more information into the same small squares of parchment. Not just names now, but the places where men and women came from. Towns and villages dotted across the map. each one a cluster of other names, other lives, none of which the battle songs would ever mention. Rusty moved between cots like a man dancing a grim, unending pattern. Halflings are often thought of as creatures of comfort, and he did love his pipe, his food, his quiet moments. But in that field hospital, he became something else entirely. Brisk, precise, unwilling to waste either time or sentiment. He cracked jokes as he worked, not because anything was funny, but because silence in such places presses on the chest like another weight. Yara listened. At first, he tried to record everything. Words spoken, cries stifled, reassurances muttered between strangers. Soon he realized no ink could hold that much. He shifted instead to essentials. Name, origin, condition, a line or two about the circumstances. When someone had the breath to explain, tripped in the ditch, fell under horse, held the line at the willows. He turned lived moments into brief phrases, because that was all the paper allowed. Outside the tents, the battle roared in ways he could not see. Standards tipped, surged, vanished. Orders flew like arrows. Units wheeled and collided. All this Yara glimpsed only in the pauses between waves of injured, when the wind shifted and brought the distant clamour to his ears. His war was counted in heartbeats between arrivals, in how long the water lasted in the basins, in how many times Rusty washed his hands each hour. Later, reading his records, I was struck by the ordinary details squeezed between the lines. Someone had smuggled a loaf of bread into the tent and torn pieces off for those who could still chew. Someone else hummed tunelessly a lullaby learned from a grandmother long since buried in a far safer place. A medic complained that his boots were too tight, then apologized because he knew there were people nearby who would never need boots again. None of that ever makes it into the official accounts. Commanders speak of positions, reinforcements, tactical withdrawals. Chroniclers draw arrows on maps. They note that the north held at Brenner, that Nilfgaard's push stalled, that morale was lifted for a time. It is all true in its way. Yet when I read Yara's cramped script, the battle looks less like a single heroic moment and more like a long day in which too many people tried, in too many small ways, not to let one another fall. You may think that distant, abstract. It is not. We all have our Brenners, though on a smaller scale. Days when we wake knowing that something is coming we are not prepared for. Days when we move from task to task with a tightness in the throat, trying not to look directly at the thing looming beyond the horizon. We brew coffee instead of medicinal herbs, write emails instead of casualty lists. But the feeling is not so different. We cope by focusing on what is in front of us, the bandage to be tied, the form to be filled, the companion to be reassured with a joke that lands poorly and still does its job. When I finally sat down with Yara, years later, he told me he often felt ashamed that his hands had never held a weapon on that day. He had held quills, towels, cups of water. He had held the ends of bandages while Rusty tied them off. He had held, once or twice, when no one else was nearby, another man's hand until it loosened. To him, these acts seemed pale beside the charge, the clash, the shouts that echoed through the stories told afterwards. I told him what I will tell you. The world is not stitched together by grand gestures alone. Someone must write the names. Someone must remember that the man in the third cot from the left liked to talk about his dog, or his orchard, or the river near his home. Someone must keep the ink flowing so that when the songs have faded, a line or two of plain prose remains, saying simply, "He was here, she was here, they mattered." In the great saga of Ciri's life, Brenna appears only at the edges. She was far from that field, moving through other dangers. Geralt and Yennefer were elsewhere too, following threads that would lead them to Stygia, to decisions none of us were ready for. Yet Brenna formed part of the world they walked in. It was one of the weights on the scale, one of the reasons kings and emperors later claimed they were tired of war even as they schemed for new ways to wage it. So, no, I will not give you a stirring chorus about that battle. Others have done so, and done it well enough. I will give you instead a vision of a halfling bending over a cot, a young scribe wiping his pen, a soldier staring at the canvas roof and counting the stitches to keep from thinking about the sounds outside. Because we still wonder whether the true shape of history is found not in the proud lines carved into monuments, but in the crowded margins where someone like Yara once tried, with failing light and cramped fingers, to write down every name he could before the ink, or the day, ran out. Before you can understand how Yennefer sat in Vilgefortz's fortress, you must remember that she had once stood on a very different island with fire in her hands. Thened had been meant as a gathering of mages, a meeting of minds, a place where the most powerful intellects of the age could argue over policy and the nature of magic, while servants poured wine and storms battered the cliffs below. Instead, it became a slaughterhouse lit by spells. News of that night reached me in fragments. A scream of light over Aretusa, towers cracking, illusions burning away to reveal soldiers where scholars should have been. Yennefer was there, tangled in plots that had been woven under her nose, and in some cases with her own cautious consent. She had tried to choose the least terrible side, and found, as many do, that there was no such thing. In the chaos that followed, Vilgefortz slipped away. Yennefer did not. He took her, not in the way ballads enjoy describing, quick and violent, but in the quieter way that sometimes follows. She woke in Stygia, his mountain stronghold, disoriented and furious, stripped not of her dignity, for that clung to her like a second skin, but of the means to express it. The rooms she opened her eyes in were beautiful. Vilgefortz liked order and elegance. It reassured him. Stone walls, smooth as poured wax, windows that gave onto dizzying drops and distant peaks, glass that caught the light in a dozen colours. He bound her with more than chains. Those were there, of course, forged with such care that they could drink in power, leaving her hands numb of even the simplest spell. Yet the greater prison was made of knowledge. He knew her history, her ambitions, the price she had paid to become what she was. He spoke to her not as to a slave, but as to a colleague who had taken a wrong turn. That is a subtle cruelty, to address someone you are torturing as if you are both reasonable people engaged in a long debate. When I picture Yennefer in Stygia, I see her seated in a chair too artfully carved, back straight despite exhaustion, eyes narrowed. Vilgefortz stands before her, hands clasped, explaining why what he is doing is necessary. He speaks of chaos, of the need to guide it, of the stupidity of kings. He speaks of Ciri, always arriving at that name as if it were both a prize and a solution. If they shape the girl, he tells Yennefer, if they use her blood and talent correctly, the world can be remade into something less foolish, less wasteful. Yennefer listens. That is her other prison. She is too intelligent to shut her ears. She has seen the arrogance of rulers and the clumsiness of revolutions. A part of her knows that the existing order is built on rot. Another part knows that men like Vilgefortz do not repair rot. They simply rearrange it to suit their own taste. He does not starve her. He is not a brute of that simple kind. Food arrives, precise and carefully seasoned. Her hair is brushed by hands that tremble with fear of her even when she cannot move a muscle by magic. Her clothes are changed. The candles in her cell are replaced before they burn too low. All this refinement is meant to prove a point. You are not my enemy, it says. You are my reluctant partner, my future ally. Once you see that I am right. There were moments when the pain was less polite. Spells designed to pry open the mind, to test the limits of her power without leaving obvious scars. I will not dwell on them. Not because they do not matter, but because the world has always been too eager to linger over the torments of clever women. What I will tell you is that those moments did not break her in the way Vilgefortz expected. They did something stranger. They stripped away layers she had used to protect herself for years. Yennefer had built a life on control. She controlled her appearance, her surroundings, her reputation. She bargained with kings, seduced and terrified in equal measure, always keeping one hand on the reins of any room she entered. In Stygia, tied to a chair under the gaze of a man who considered himself her superior, she had nothing left to manage but her own silence. She chose when to speak, when to spit, when to laugh in his face. I'm told she did laugh. Once, after he delivered a particularly elaborate explanation of his grand design, stepping back as if to admire his own rhetoric, she lifted her head and laughed until tears gathered in the corners of her eyes. Not hysterically, not with despair, with something colder, almost tender. The sound unsettled him. He demanded to know what amused her. She told him that he reminded her of every arrogant little boy she had ever seen building castles in sand while the tide crept in. It was a small victory, but small victories in such places are like cracks in glass. They weaken what seems solid. Vilgefortz responded with anger, then with another monologue, then with adjustments to her bonds, but he could not take back the moment in which he had been reduced, in her eyes, to the level of a child with a bucket. Outside her prison, Stygia gathered other pieces of his scheme: mutants, experiments, mercenaries. Men and women who had believed his promises of power or simply liked the idea of serving someone who did not pretend to be bound by old loyalties. The castle stood like a stain on the mountain, a place where the world's discards and the ambitious came to be reforged. I sometimes think of Yennefer there when I pass by certain fine houses in cities at peace. A woman looks out from an upper window, perfectly dressed, every hair in place. Inside, she might be trapped by nothing so dramatic as magical shackles. Perhaps it is the expectations of a family, the finances that do not allow leaving, the quiet dread of starting again alone. We like to imagine prisons as dramatic dungeons with rattling chains. More often, they look like immaculate rooms full of things that do not belong to us, with doors that remain politely closed. Yennefer's strength in Stygia lay not in escape, for she could not yet break her bonds, but in refusal. She refused to accept Vilgefortz's version of the story. She refused to let him turn Ciri into a mere component in his engine. She refused to believe that all the roads she had walked with Geralt, all the promises she had broken and kept, led only here to being a cog in someone else's grand design. At night, when even the guards were half asleep and the mountain winds howled around Stygia's sharp edges, she must have lain awake and thought of the people she had lost, and those she still hoped to see again. Geralt, somewhere in the north or south, stubbornly alive, if only out of spite. Ciri, flickering between worlds. Her own younger self, the hunchback girl who had once stared at the ceiling of a shabby room and promised she would never again be this helpless. But we still wonder whether the hardest part of her captivity was not the pain or the helplessness, but the knowledge that elsewhere, in some other corner of the world, people were making decisions in her name, drawing conclusions from her silence, while she waited in a castle of shining stone for the chance to speak her own will again. Roads remember, not in words, but in the way ruts deepen and stones grow smooth. The track that carried Geralt and his companions toward Stygia felt like one of those roads that knows it is leading people to an end. The air along it was ordinary enough, smelling of damp earth and smoke, yet every step seemed to fall a little heavier than the last. Their company had settled into its final shape. Geralt walked a fraction ahead, as he always did when the goal was sharp and close. Milva moved with the wary poise of a hunter who expects bad news in every rustle. Cahir rode straight-backed, trying at once to be guard, penitent, and friend. Angoulême wove around them, tossing quick remarks like small stones at a pond, hoping to break the surface of their silence. Regis followed with that unhurried stride of his, as if he had all the time in the world and was willing to spend it on this one road. I had walked beside them once, long before. I knew the sound of their shared laughter, the rhythm of their quarrels. Now, from the stories that reached me, I recognized a different cadence. Jokes still appeared, but they were short-lived creatures, fluttering up and falling quickly. Most evenings, the talk sank back into the crackle of the fire and the small, homely noises of people cleaning weapons and rubbing stiffness from tired limbs. Nothing about the countryside announced that a reckoning drew near. Low hills, fields waiting for spring, patches of thinning forest, villages where dogs barked, children stared, and adults glanced up only long enough to judge whether the travellers meant trouble. The world rarely throws lightning over the road to our most important moments. More often it sends mud and a headwind, and the quiet temptation to turn back and call the whole thing impossible. They camped where dusk caught them, a hollow out of the wind, a tangle of trees beside a ditch, an abandoned sheepfold with 3 sound walls, and a roof that pretended to be whole. Firelight pulled their faces out of the dark and gave each of them a small circle in which to be themselves. Milva sat with her back to something solid whenever she could, hands busy with bow, string, fletching. Cahir hovered near the edge of the light, as if unsure whether he was entitled to its warmth. Angoulême complained loudly about hard ground and thin stew, only to drift asleep in mid-sentence. Regis brewed infusions that smelled either comforting or disastrous. Somehow they were always drinkable. They all knew this road offered no safe loop back to where they had started. There are journeys from which one either does not return or returns as someone else. They had agreed to that truth back when they turned their faces towards Stygia. Saying it aloud now would have been like reciting a sentence they had already signed at the bottom of. So instead, they spoke of practical things. How far to the next water? Whether the horse needed a rest day? Whether the sky promised rain, or merely empty threats? If you have ever walked a loved one toward a difficult appointment, filling the time with remarks about traffic and weather, you know the pattern. The mind circles the central fear and touches everything around it instead. It is not cowardice, only a way of moving forward without freezing. Geralt, from what I later heard, became quieter still. He had always hoarded words, but on that road even his silences changed. Before, his quiet moments had held a kind of wary peace, the rest of a man who knew he would soon be asked to draw steel again. Now there was something else in them, a tension that did not ease even at the fireside. Somewhere in a fortress of stone, Yennefer sat under Vilgefortz's gaze. Somewhere in the tangled skein of worlds, Ciri ran and fought and grew, with no guarantee that anyone would reach her in time. Every step towards Stygia was also a step deeper into those thoughts. Regis tried to keep them tethered to smaller, manageable things. He reminded Milva to stretch her back, warned Angoulême not to sharpen her tongue quite as often as her knife, advised Cahir to sleep when his turn-off watch came instead of brooding over the embers. He spoke with the easy tone of a host fussing over guests, yet each remark carried the weight of long experience. Those who have lived through many endings understand the value of a washed pot, a mended strap, a good cup of something hot. One evening by a sluggish river, Angoulême gave shape to what they were all carrying. She asked what would happen afterward, after Stygia, after Ciri, after Yennefer, after the one clear task that had pulled such different people into the same line of march. Geralt watched the water for a long time before answering. It slid past, brown and patient, carrying bits of leaf and twig towards some nameless town. When he finally spoke, he said he did not know. He could see as far as the fortress, as far as the attempt to pull two people he loved out of it. Beyond that, the path vanished. To some ears, that might sound like failure. Heroes, in the tales we dress them in, are supposed to have plans that reach beyond the visible horizon. Yet Angoulême would later say that his honesty steadied her more than any fine promise could have. It is easier to walk beside someone who admits they are guessing too. Statues may be impressive, but they are poor companions. Fear walked with them, as surely as any of their shadows. It showed itself in the way Milva's hands shook briefly when she thought no one noticed, in Cahir's jaw clenched whenever Nilfgaard was mentioned, in the way Angoulême's jokes grew thinner as the days shortened. Regis alone seemed untouched, though now and then his gaze went far beyond the line of trees, as if counting how many possible futures still remained open to them. Day followed day, hooves, boots, the scrape of pots, the hiss of damp wood on flames. Behind them, Toussaint faded into story. Low tables heavy with food, bright banners, Fringilla's shaded rooms, nights when it had been possible to pretend that the world would wait. Ahead, the mountains gathered like dark thoughts, and somewhere among them Stygia raised its teeth of stone. Between those two lay this narrow stretch of time when they were still together, and still only potentially ghosts. Stop any one of us on such a road and ask why we keep going, and the answers sound simple. Geralt might have said that he did not know how to live with himself if he turned aside. Milva might have muttered that she was too stubborn to abandon people once she had taken their side. Cahir might have spoken of paying back a debt that would never quite be paid. Angoulême would have scoffed, then admitted very softly that she did not want to be the kind of person who ran. Regis might have smiled and said that chances to do the right thing are rare, and he had ignored enough of them in earlier centuries. From my chair by the window, surrounded by notes and old ink, their march towards Stygia looks less like a heroic charge and more like the kind of long, quiet crisis many of us know. You wake, you dress, you eat, you do your work, and all the while a single fact hums beneath everything. You are walking toward a conversation, a decision, a confrontation you can no longer postpone. Nothing spectacular happens on most of those days, yet each one brings you closer to the moment that will ask you who you really are. When at last the grey outline of Stygia showed on the ridge, they saw more than stone and battlements. They saw the shape of their own choices, layered step upon step. All the evenings when they might have turned back and did not. All the comforts they had left behind in vineyards and warm rooms. The road had brought them there, but it had not dragged them. Each pace had been taken under its own small ordinary decision, again forward, and we still wonder whether it is on such long, apparently uneventful roads that our true measure is taken, in the countless moments when we choose to keep moving toward what frightens us, because somewhere beneath the fear we know that turning back would be a quieter and more enduring kind of loss. No painter has ever quite captured Stygia. They always make it too romantic. They give it proud lines, dramatic clouds, a sense of Gothic grandeur. From the accounts I have read, it was uglier than that. A lump of stone on a mountainside, like a bad tooth in a tired jaw. The sort of place you build when your first priority is not being loved, but not being reached. I was not there. I did not see the last climb, the last scramble over loose rock and frozen soil. What I know has been stitched together from the reports of people who survived, from sorcerers' visions glimpsed long after, and from the few sentences Geralt ever allowed to escape his guarded mouth. Nothing about those sources agrees perfectly. That, to me, is how you know they are close to the truth. Perfect stories are almost always lies. They went up the mountain in a line broken more by caution than by distance. The air was thin, the wind cut, the rocks underfoot shifted with the sullen reluctance of things that do not like to be stepped on. Ahead, Stygia hunched against the sky, its walls blind and grey. Somewhere inside, Yennefer sat in her carved chair of chains and courtesy. Somewhere inside, Vilgefortz walked his polished corridors, certain that he was prepared for anything. They split, as any small band must when facing a fortress. Some went to draw attention, some to search for cracks, some to do the quiet work that never makes it into songs. I will not map their paths for you stone by stone. It is enough to know that Stygia swallowed them in pieces. Milva fell first, not immediately, not with the simple finality of a single blow, but the way a bowstring finally snaps after too many hard draws. She had been wounded earlier, an arrow, a fall, the sort of thing an archer shrugs off because there is still work to do. She pressed on, teeth clenched, shoulders hunched, saving her curses for the enemy. When the fighting thickened around one of the approaches, when shouts and spells and the flat, ugly sound of metal on bone crashed together, she found a perch, a fragment of wall, a slope, somewhere she could see and cover those below. She did what she had always done best, picked targets, loosed shafts, shifted, loosed again. Accounts say that more than one of Vilgefortz's hirelings fell before they ever knew from which angle death had arrived. At some point her legs gave way. She slid down behind cover, the world spinning, the pain in her side blooming with every breath. Someone shouted her name. She told them to shut up and keep moving. Later, one of the survivors wrote that as they pulled back from that section of wall, they saw her propped against stone, bow across her knees, arrow knocked but no longer drawn, eyes half closed as if watching a distant tree line only she could see. There was no time for ceremony. There rarely is. The battle pulled the living onward, step by step, deeper into Stigger's gut. Milva stayed on that cold slope, leaving behind a hollow in the line where a steady voice and a wickedly accurate arrow had been. Cahir's end came closer to the heart of the fortress. He had spent so many years wrapped in the armour of Nilfgaard, both literal and symbolic, that sometimes he seemed more spectre than man. To the north he had been the Black Rider, nightmare of a little princess. To himself he had become a question. What do you do after realizing you were on the wrong side of your own story? In Stigger he found one answer, a corridor, narrow and echoing, shouts behind, spells ahead. Geralt needed a moment, a door, a chance to break through. Jensen, one of the Scoia'tael who had somehow ended up among them, later described the scene simply. Cahir stepped forward, shield lifted, sword held not with the polish of parade drills, but with the raw grip of someone with nothing left to save, except his choice. He blocked what he could. Steel, arrows, the rush of bodies. He called out for others to pass, to run, to not waste the opening. Even now, decades later, I can hear in that description the ghost of another time, another doorway, when he had ridden through flames in Sintra's streets as a hunter, not a guard. This time he held. They forced their way past while he took the blows. When he finally fell, it was not with the theatrical collapse of a stage hero, but with a small, exhausted motion, like someone finally setting down a heavy burden. Angoulême, bright and careless, and too young by any sensible measure, did not have a single grand death either. She was cut down in the confusion of one of the inner courtyards, a place where stairs, balconies and walkways tangled like roots. She'd been darting in and out of the fight, knife in hand, laughter somehow still finding its way to her lips, even as the air thickened with dust and fear. A surviving Scoia'tael said he saw her pause to help a wounded comrade toward cover, all sharp angles and muttered insults, trying to make him angry enough to stay alive. An instant later, something struck her and she went down, surprise more than pain on her face. That is all. No prophecy, no last speech, just a girl who had chosen for once to stand with someone instead of running from everyone. and paid the cost that choice often demands. And Regis, Regis, the vampire who had learned to be gentler than most humans I know. His confrontation with Vilgefortz has been twisted into all sorts of lurid nonsense in later retellings. I will not repeat the worst of it. What truly matters is that he chose to face the mage knowing perfectly well that the odds were not simply poor, but insulting. They met in one of the higher halls, if the visions are accurate. White stone, broken statues, the air sharp with residual magic. Regis tried, as he always did, to reason first. He spoke of alternatives, of retreats, of different paths. Vilgefortz answered with the serene contempt of a man who has forgotten that every plan has a cost. When words failed, Regis moved. Fast, precise, every bit of strength he had gathered over long, careful years poured into one brief attempt to remove a monster from the world. He did not succeed, but he did something just as important. He forced Vilgefortz to turn, to spend power, to focus on him instead of on Geralt's approach. He created a crack, a moment. If you like your heroics loud, you will find this unsatisfying. If you understand that history is often shaped by such stolen instants, you will see why I still raise a cup to Regis on cold evenings. Geralt's duel with Vilgefortz has been sung to tatters. I have heard versions where they fight atop spires on bridges of light, in chambers full of mirrors. The truth, as far as I can tell, was grimmer and simpler. A man with a staff and a gift for magic against a man with a sword and an obstinate refusal to die. Spells, yes, and tricks and feints. Blood on stone. Anger sharpened into something more focused than rage. In the end, Geralt killed him. That is the bare fact. It did not bring back Milva, or Cahir, or Angoulême, or Regis. It did not erase the rooms in which Yennefer had sat, listening to his explanations. It simply removed from the board one piece that had believed itself a player. Sometimes that is all victory means. He found Yennefer afterward, not in some pristine tower, but in a cell whose luxury made its purpose all the more obscene. She was weak, thinner, but her eyes were still the same dark, furious violet. For a moment, all the noise of Stygia seemed to thin around them. Two people who had lost one another too often stood in the center of the ruin they had both, in different ways, helped create. What did they say? Very little, I suspect. There is a point beyond which language cannot keep up. He freed her, helped her stand. She leaned on him more than pride would normally allow. He tolerated it without a joke. That was their reunion, not a blaze of romance, not a tidy reconciliation, but two exhausted, stubborn souls trying once more to move in the same direction. When Geralt later spoke of Stygia at all, it was rarely about the duel or the destruction. It was about the absences, the spaces at the fire that would never be filled again. The jokes that hung in the air with no one left to deliver them. The strange lightness of surviving when others had not. And we still wonder whether the defeat of a man like Vilgefortz can ever be weighed properly against the quiet, irreplaceable weight of those who fell to make that defeat possible, or whether such scales were broken the first time we tried to balance them. You might think that once the great villain has fallen, the story would have the decency to slow down. The fortress collapses, the dust settles, the survivors limp away under a sky suddenly kinder. That is how we like our endings, clear, decisive, with the main shadow dispelled. Stigger did not oblige. No sooner had Vilgefortz gone to whatever judgment awaits men like him than another figure stepped into the emptied space, one whose shadow had been on this tale from the beginning. Emhyr var Emreis arrived too late to fight, and just in time to complicate everything. The Emperor of Nilfgaard did not climb the slope alone, of course. He came with guards, officers, the cold efficiency of an army that knows how to move even through ruin. The fortress at Stigger was already wounded, its walls scorched, its corridors littered with the debris of spells and steel. Emhyr walked through it the way a man walks through a house he once visited in a dream, noting differences, measuring damage, unconcerned with the bodies that had made those cracks possible. Geralt and Yennefer, bruised, burned, and bound together once more by more than chains, had just enough breath to be angry. Angry that he was here. Angry that he had the leisure to look around. Angry that their hard-won victory had turned the fortress into a stage for someone else's entrance. They faced him not as supplicants or conquered foes, but as two people whose patience had reached the end of its thin, frayed tether. Then Ciri appeared. She had climbed other mountains before, had stumbled through worse places than Stigger's broken halls. Yet there was something particularly bitter about this ascent. She came not as a child dragged, nor as a captive coerced, but as someone who understood that all the running she had done had led here, to a room where three people would stand facing one another with too much past between them. When she stepped into Emhyr's sight, the world seemed to contract around that triangle. Emperor, Witcher, girl. To the onlookers, soldiers, survivors, a scattering of bewildered hirelings, the scene must have looked almost theatrical. Emhyr in his black and gold, imposing even without a throne. Geralt, white-haired and bloodied, sword lowered but not forgotten. Ciri, smaller than either of them, clothes torn, eyes too old for her face. One could have painted it as a family reunion or as a confrontation between symbols. It was, in truth, both and neither. I had known Emhyr once as Dunny, though briefly and badly. A cursed knight with a hedgehog's face, a man who had loved Calanthe's daughter enough to gamble kingdoms on their marriage. That man seemed a ghost now, buried beneath layers of imperial will. Yet, when he spoke at Stigger, the ghost flickered. He called Ciri by name, not as an emperor addressing a subject, but as a father recognizing a child lost long ago. His voice carried something rougher than command. He laid out his intentions with the terrible calm of someone convinced that necessity excuses anything. He spoke of prophecy, of elder blood, of lines that must be fulfilled. The false Ciri in Nilfgaard, he admitted, had been a stand-in, a political bandage over a wound that had never closed. The true daughter stood before him now. With her by his side, he claimed he could reshape the world. Wars could end, borders could settle, chaos could be channeled instead of spilling everywhere. Underneath the grand phrases lay a plan that should never have been spoken, a union that confused roles which must forever remain separate, a marriage between father and daughter dressed up in the silk of destiny and statecraft. He presented it not as perversion, but as sacrifice, as the price both of them would pay so that others might live more peacefully. That is how the worst ideas often arrive, wrapped in the vocabulary of duty. Geralt listened, jaw tightening, hand hovering near his sword hilt, not because he thought he could cut the madness out of the air, but because his body did not know what else to do. Yennefer looked from Emhyr to Ciri and back again with an expression I can only imagine, the kind you wear when you realize the nightmare you have dreaded has chosen a different mask, but the same eyes. Ciri said little at first. She had spent too long hearing others tell her what her blood meant, what her womb meant, what her life should serve. Now, in Stigger's wounded halls, she let Emhyr talk. Let him unfold his tidy justifications, his map of a future in which she was both keystone and captive. When he finished, when his voice finally ran out of arguments, she answered. There are conflicting accounts of her exact words. That does not matter. All the versions agree on their shape. She refused, not timidly, not with careful qualifications, but with the flat, fierce certainty of someone who has been pushed to the edge of a cliff too many times, and has finally decided she would rather build her own bridge than jump on command. She told him that whatever the prophecies said, whatever designs sorcerers and emperors had spun, her body and her choices were not bargaining chips. Geralt and Yennefer stood with her, not in front of her, not speaking for her, but at her sides. For once, the three of them formed a line that no amount of rhetoric could cross. Emhyr had brought force, titles, history. They had only their exhaustion and their refusal. In another sort of story, that would not have been enough. In this one, it was. Why did he relent? Pride alone might have driven him to insist. Power certainly gave him the means. Yet something in Emhyr cracked when he faced not the abstract idea of a daughter, but the actual young woman before him, scarred, furious, unbending. Perhaps he remembered another night long ago when he had stood in Cintra's halls as a stranger asking for a girl's hand, and had been judged by a grandmother who could be as ruthless as any emperor. Perhaps he saw, in Ciri's refusal, a line he could not cross, without losing the last fragment of the man he had been. He stepped back. The offer, poisonous and dressed in gold, was withdrawn. In its place he laid another path. He would take with him his armies and his ambitions, and with them the false Ciri whose life had been bent to fit his needs. The North could claim whatever victory it liked at Brenna. The Empire would lick its wounds. For a time at least, the world would pause. Ciri was not relieved so much as stunned. She'd expected many horrors. She had not expected to be asked to participate in them under the banner of peace. To have that demand withdrawn felt less like a gift, and more like the sudden removal of a blade that had already pressed against her skin. She did not thank him. She watched as he turned away, cloak flaring, surrounded by his guards. Emperors rarely know how to leave rooms quietly. In the quiet that followed, Geralt and Yennefer did what wounded people always do when the immediate threat has passed. They checked one another for damage. They argued over who needed rest more. They hid their shaking hands in useful tasks, finding water, securing a horse, searching for a path down that would not crumble underfoot. Ciri stood apart for a moment, looking not at the departing emperor, but at the horizon he had claimed to control. From where I sit, long after, it is tempting to turn this scene into a neat moral. The tyrant confronted, the victim empowered, the family choosing found bonds over blood. There is truth in that. But it is not the whole truth. Emir did not stop being who he was. His armies did not dissolve. The politics that had hung Ciri's name around so many necks did not vanish. All that changed in Stygia was this. A girl who had been treated as destiny's servant said no loudly enough that even an emperor had to hear. We still wonder whether that refusal did more to shift the course of the world than any battle, or whether it simply marked, in one sharp word, a boundary that should have been obvious from the beginning, that no prophecy, no empire, no map of the future has the right to demand that a child pay for its fulfillment with her own soul. For all the grand cities I have sung about, it was a small town that tried to swallow us. Rivia was not impressive. A river, a marketplace, crooked streets that smelled of cabbage and wood smoke, the kind of place you pass through, promising yourself you will remember its name and then failing to do so. Yet it is Rivia, not the marble capitals, that still wakes me at night. We went there because peace, that shy and unreliable creature, had finally crept into the world. Treaties had been signed. Armies were limping home. Kings called it an end. In the gaps between their proclamations, people looked around at the ruins and began to ask whose fault it all had been. When answers are hard, crowds reach for whatever is closest. Dwarves, elves, mages, anyone whose face or way of speaking could be called strange. Geralt had business in Rivia. Simple business, or so it seemed. Helping Zoltan and a handful of non-humans find work, mediating small disputes, smoothing the kind of petty frictions that can, if ignored, grow teeth. I went along because that is what I did. I followed him into trouble, tried to turn it into a song afterwards, and occasionally managed not to get myself killed. The day itself began badly in a very ordinary way. Low clouds pressed on the roofs. The market square was already crowded when we arrived. Stalls packed shoulder to shoulder. Sellers shouted, arguing over onions and cloth, over fish that did not smell quite as fresh as advertised. A few dwarves had set up their own stand, tools laid out in careful rows. Nearby, an elf girl sold herbs, eyes down, hands moving quickly. At first, the tension was only a flavour in the air, like too much salt in a stew. Raised voices, a muttered insult, a shove that went a fraction beyond what the situation required. A stone flew. No one admitted to throwing it. It struck a soldier in the helmet, which rang loud enough to startle everyone. He staggered, blood running where the edge had cut his scalp. It should have ended with curses and threats. Instead, he shouted, called for his comrades, called for order. Called, perhaps without meaning to, for someone to blame. And the crowd gave him an answer. Fingers pointed toward the dwarves, toward the elf girl, toward any face that did not fit the simplest picture of us. Within minutes, words turned into hands, hands into fists. Fists reached for whatever they could grab. A stall overturned, apples rolling like marbles across the cobbles. A dwarf went down under a kick. Someone screamed. The scream did not belong to any particular race or side. It belonged to fear itself. I did what I always do when things turn ugly. I climbed onto a crate, lute in hand, and tried to shout the crowd down. You may laugh. A song against a mob. A verse against a tide. Yet sometimes a tune can startle people back into themselves. I have seen rioters pause, blades halfway drawn, because a familiar melody tugged at their childhood for one breath. Not that day. My voice cracked on the first line. Someone jostled the crate, and I nearly fell. A hand grabbed my ankle. Whether to pull me down or steady me, I do not know. I saw Geralt pushing through the throng, not with sword drawn, but with his hands up, palms open. He shouted for calm, for sense, for soldiers to stand down. His words were swallowed. You must understand this about Geralt. He had spent a lifetime standing between monsters and people. Rivia asked him to stand between people and themselves, and that is a more dangerous place. A beast has claws, fangs, motives you can name. A crowd has only its own reflection, distorted beyond recognition. He reached the dwarves first, shouldering men aside, blocking blows with his forearms, his back. He moved like he always did in tight spaces, efficient, precise, minimizing harm where he could. But every time he pushed one attacker away, another surged in. The soldiers, feeling both embarrassed and threatened, began to swing in wide arcs, their weapons more argument than defense. I made it as far as the edge of that knot of bodies before something struck me from behind. A club, perhaps, or a shield. The world lurched. Cobblestones rose to meet my cheek with all the tender concern of stone. For a moment I saw nothing but boots. They stamped, slipped, stumbled, belonged to humans, dwarves, soldiers, civilians. No race has a monopoly on clumsiness or cruelty. Through the forest of legs I glimpsed Geralt again. He had finally drawn his sword, but he held it low, using the flat, the hilt, anything but the edge when he could. He shouted at a soldier whose blade was raised too high over a fleeing child. He stepped between a man with an axe and a dwarf who had lost his footing. He was not fighting for a side. He was fighting for everyone's chance to walk away. In the stories people later told, the moment itself became grand, symbolic. The Witcher felled by human hatred. In my memory, it was quicker and more stupid than that. A man with a pitchfork lunged in from behind, face twisted with fear rather than malice. Geralt had turned to shout something to someone else. The tines punched into him with the horrible simplicity of farm work. I remember his eyes more than the wound, widening not with surprise that someone had tried to hurt him, but with disbelief that this, of all things, could reach him. After monsters and mages, after wars and experiments, to be undone by a panicked peasant with a tool meant for hay. Yennefer arrived in Rivia as storms arrive in summer, suddenly, with electricity in the air. I did not see her enter the square. I heard her. Her voice cut through the noise, sharp as the edge of a broken mirror. For a moment, the mob hesitated, that old instinctive unease in the presence of a sorceress. Then she saw Geralt, slack in the arms of those who had managed to drag him a little away from the thickest crush. She went to him, every movement pure focus. I have seen Yennefer play roles: coquette, confidant, queen's advisor. None of those faces were present then. Only the mage who refused to accept the rules of bodies and blood. She laid her hands on him. The air heaved. Heat rolled off her in waves, smelling faintly of smoke and the first spring flowers. Power poured through her and into him, not in gentle channels, but in a flood. Magic, like wine, can be overpoured. There is always a cost. Yennefer did not care. She burned herself raw trying to coax his life back. For a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw colour return to his cheeks, tension to his muscles. Then the force she had summoned turned on its summoner. She gasped, eyes wide, and crumpled beside him. Two figures, side by side on the stones, one pale, one drawn tight, both terribly still. If you have ever stood at a hospital bed, or in a quiet room where someone you love lies motionless, you know the taste of that moment. Sounds blur. Time loses its shape. You feel both heavy and hollow, as if gravity has forgotten where to pull you. You may remember absurd details, the pattern on a blanket, the squeak of a shoe in the hallway, the way your own hands will not stop shaking. I remember a dropped apple rolling in slow arcs near Yennefer's hair. I remember my own breath making shallow, frightened noises. What happened next, I saw and did not see. Pain and a blow had made the world patchy. Faces swam, the sky tilted. Yet even through that haze, some images burned themselves into me. The square fell strangely quiet, as if the riot had exhausted its own fuel. People backed away, suddenly aware of what they had done and terrified of admitting it. In the stillness, hooves rang on stone. Not horses. Lighter. Stranger. Ihwaraquax. The unicorn stepped into the square as though it had been waiting just out of sight, displeased with what it had heard. Beside him, or perhaps not beside, but suddenly there, Ciri appeared, older than when I had last truly known her, more composed than any young woman should be, yet with that same wildness flashing in her eyes. She knelt by Geralt and Yennefer, touched their faces as if to anchor them. There are accounts that speak of words exchanged, of decisions made in that moment between girl and mentor, and man, who had been father and more. I remember only the sense that something was being negotiated far beyond the reach of any emperor's decree. Ciri stood, drew breath, and the world around her seemed to fold. A mist rose, not from the river, but from the very air, curling around the three of them. Through it I glimpsed the outline of a boat, low and white, rocking on water I could not hear. Figures moved upon it, indistinct, waiting. Geralt and Yennefer were lifted, or perhaps they simply were no longer lying at our feet. Ciri flung one last look at us, at me, at the foolish town of Rivia, and then stepped toward the mist. For a heartbeat, the boat was clear. Hull pale as bone, prow cutting through vapour instead of waves. Then the fog thickened, and they were gone. In their place, the marketplace remained what it had always been. Stalls, cobbles, overturned baskets. And us, a handful of the living, blinking in weak sunlight that felt suddenly undeserved. Later people argued, had we seen a real boat, a real lake? Was it some elven artifact, some magical construct, some shared hallucination born of grief? Scholars muttered about Avalon, the Isle of Apples, borrowed from southern myths. Nimue and her kind squinted through dreams, trying to trace where the path of that vessel had gone. None of us could say for certain. What I know is this: Rivia was a small place, and yet on that day it became the narrow neck of an hourglass through which too many lives had to pass. A pogrom sparked by fear, a witcher felled by stupidity, a sorceress burning herself down to a cinder, a girl and a unicorn opening a door no one else could follow through. And we still wonder whether the boat that carried them away sailed into some kinder realm, or whether it simply slipped beyond the reach of our stories, leaving us on the shore to face, with empty hands, the damage our own very ordinary fears had already done. Nights are longer now. There was a time when I felt cheated if I slept before dawn, when I measured the success of an evening by how hoarse my voice was, and how many candles had burned down to wax puddles at the bottom of wine bottles. These days I find myself awake at hours when even taverns give up, when the streets outside my window are as empty as a stage after the last curtain has fallen. That is when their faces come back most clearly. Geralt, Yennefer, Ciri, not as statues or symbols, not as the simplified shapes that fit so neatly into songs, but as they were on ordinary days. Geralt sitting on a bench with one boot off, rubbing his ankle and pretending not to enjoy the warmth of the sun. Yennefer frowning over a letter that refused to say what she wanted it to, ink drying in impatient strokes. Ciri balanced on a fence, hair in a hopeless tangle, trying to whistle a tune I had only just taught her and getting the rhythm entirely wrong. People come to me sometimes, mostly young, mostly full of a kind of hunger I recognize too well. They want to know how it ended. Not the battles and the treaties. They have read about those. They want to know whether the white boat on the misted lake sailed to paradise, to another world, to death, to something nameless. They would like, ideally, an answer that fits into a neat clause. I never give them one. It is not that I do not have my own guesses. I have more than I can use. I imagine Geralt and Yennefer waking on a shore where no one knows their names, their scars no longer a debt anyone can call in. I imagine Ciri riding through yet another world, laughing in that reckless way of hers, startling people who thought all miracles had already been catalogued. Some nights I think of them resting, others I think of them still moving, because I cannot quite picture them going still. But I have spent a lifetime watching what happens when you hand people a definitive ending. They hold it to the light, admire it, and then use it to close a door they might have left open. They say, that is that. The story is finished. Nothing more to see here. The truth is almost always less tidy. After Rivia, life did not stop in deference to my grief. It never does. The next day, bakers still rose before dawn to knead dough. Children still argued over marbles or scraps of wood carved into knights. Someone fell in love in the wrong house at the wrong time. Someone else sat alone at a table built for two and pretended not to notice the empty chair. I did what men like me always do. I picked up my lute. My hands shook at first. The strings felt unfamiliar, as if they belonged to some other musician. In the first tavern where I tried to sing after Rivia, the room blurred. I stumbled on lyrics I had known for decades. Someone at the back coughed impatiently. Someone else raised a mug and demanded the old favourites, the ones where the witcher always survives and the punchline always lands. For a while I obliged. It was easier to slip back into the familiar ballads, to let them run their course through me like well-worn riverbeds. Only at the end of the night, when the crowd had thinned and the candles had guttered, did I allow myself to play the quieter melodies, little pieces with no words, or with only one line repeated so softly that no one could claim to have heard it clearly. Those were the songs for the absent. As the years went on, tales about Geralt, Yennefer, and Ciri multiplied without my help. In some, the Witcher lived on as an immortal guardian, forever wandering the borderlands, sword in hand. In others, Ciri became a queen, who ruled with perfect wisdom in a country no cartographer has ever found. Yennefer, depending on the teller, either sacrificed herself on an altar of pure altruism, or retired to a tower decorated entirely in black and silver, terrorizing generations of apprentices. I listened, sometimes hidden in the back of the crowd, sometimes in plain sight. I winced at the worst of the inventions and smiled at the rare moment when a stranger, without knowing it, stumbled close to who they had been. I learned to hear in those embellished stories something other than insult. People need their legends. They need figures who stand a little taller than life, who can be blamed or praised for things the rest of us only feel in small, private ways. Still, I kept my own versions. Late at night, when a friend or a fool had drunk enough to ask for the truth, I would tell them a little, not everything. The whole of it barely fits inside my own chest. I would speak of a girl who was more tired than her age should allow, of a man who never quite believed he deserved to be loved, of a woman who was more frightened of her own tenderness than of any enemy. From time to time, scholars visited, men and women with ink on their fingers and questions folded inside their sleeves. They wanted dates, places, corroborated details. Did the Battle of Brenna truly turn on a halfling's decisions in a field hospital? Was there really a false Ciri in Nilfgaard? Had the wild hunt been nothing more than elves on winged horses? Or was there something stranger, something older? I answered as best I could, which is to say, I told them when I did not know. You would be surprised how rarely historians hear those words. They write them down carefully, frowning, as if uncertain how to file them. Then they leave and arrange their own conclusions on shelves. Perhaps, years from now, a sorceress like Nimue will read those pages and send her dreams chasing after the white boat. Perhaps she already has, somewhere beyond the reach of my age. As for you, listening now, possibly with dishes waiting in your sink or a lamp burning lower than you meant it to, I should tell you why I have gone to all this trouble. It is not only to honor them, though that would be reason enough. It is also to remind you of something we both keep forgetting. Most of our days look nothing like Stygia or Rivia. They look like small choices in narrow corridors. Do you speak when someone makes an easy joke at another's expense, or do you laugh and let it pass? Do you pause when you see a stranger stumble, or do you look away and hurry on? Do you cling to a comfort that has secretly become a cage, or do you step out into a chill street with no idea where you will sleep? Geralt did not become who he was in one clash of steel. Yennefer did not harden and soften in a single spell. Ciri was not forged only in deserts and palaces and fortresses. They were shaped on ordinary mornings as much as on legendary nights, by their pettiest mistakes and their smallest kindnesses. The same is true for you and for me, however little bards may sing about it. One day, if the world lasts, someone will sit where I am sitting now. They will tell stories about people you have never heard of, people who are alive somewhere in this moment, bent over their own work, worrying their own worries. Perhaps your name will appear in a line of their notes. Or perhaps you will survive only as a faint echo in the habits of those who knew you. Both are a kind of immortality. I will not tell you that Geralt and Yennefer lived happily ever after on some untouched shore. I will not swear that Ciri found rest, or that she did not. I will tell you only that they tried, as stubbornly as they knew how, to be themselves in a world that kept insisting it had better ideas. Sometimes they failed, sometimes they did not. In the end, they stepped into a mist that none of us could follow through, leaving behind broken swords, a few letters, and more questions than answers. I look out of my window. The glass catches the first grey of dawn. For a heartbeat, the reflection shows me younger than I am, lute on my shoulder, ready for another road. Then the light shifts, and there is only an old man, ink-stained and tired, still talking because he has not yet found a good reason to stop. If you have listened this far, perhaps you will carry a fragment of their story with you, not as a polished legend, but as a reminder that no life fits neatly into the space between once upon a time and the end. There are always loose threads, unanswered letters, roads that vanish into fog, and we still wonder whether the finest thing a story can do is not to close those roads for us, but to leave them open just enough that, as you blow out your candle or set down your cup, you find yourself walking along them in your own thoughts, deciding quietly what kind of ending you would dare to live toward.